Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Kamla Ganesh, former professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai, and now a senior fellow of Indian Council of Social Science Research. In the course Sociology of the Indian Diaspora, we are now looking at issues of integration with the hostland with specific reference to the Caribbean region. The Caribbean region is very important from the point of view of the Indian diaspora because quite early in the late 19th century, groups of Indians were recruited to go to Caribbean to work in the sugar plantations. This history of indentured labor is a very important part of the Indian diasporic experience. The countries that we are dealing with majorly in this module are the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, in short Trinidad, Guyana, which was formerly British Guyana, and Suriname. All the three countries have ethnic Indian groups forming the majority of the population. They are mainly Bhojpuri speaking. All the three countries have substantial minority population of African descent. The interaction between the African group and the Indian origin group is of great antiquity. The various kinds of interaction between the groups of Indian descent and the groups of African descent have left their mark on Caribbean society, culture and politics. The objectives of this module are to introduce the region, the major countries and the convergence and divergence, to give a brief profile of the people of Indian descent, to show the ethnic diversities of this region and how these have changed into ethnic hostility, to evaluate the current situation in terms of economic development and racial harmony, and the role and issues concerning people of Indian descent. The three countries that we are dealing with, Trinidad, Guyana and Suriname, have several similarities. The native Amerindian population is minuscule. The plantation economy run by Europeans was fueled by imported African slave labor. After abolition of slavery, indentured labor from India and elsewhere was imported to fill the gap. In all three, the relations between the Indian and African segments of the population are uneasy but less hostile in Suriname. In all three, Indian origin people have remained attached to their religion, both Hinduism and Islam, and to their broader cultural milieu. The reformist Arya Samaj had some influence in the 1920s and 30s, but it did not erase the devotional Hinduism at the popular level, which adapted to the new circumstances. Traditional caste relationships have lost most of their religious sanction. The connectedness to India and the search for roots by visiting ancestral villages continues as a theme, as can be seen in the writings of Caribbean Indians like Devant Maharaj. Trinidad has fared better economically than Guyana due to its oil deposits, tourism appeal and its automobile manufacturing. Nevertheless, the masses still suffer in both countries. This is a reason for the mass exodus of immigrants from both countries to the United States and Canada. Suriname citizens have an easier access to Dutch citizenship, and in the years preceding independence, there was heavy migration to the Netherlands. The genesis of the intense hostility between Africans and Indians in Trinidad and Guyana lie in British colonial policy, as we shall see. Although it had an economic basis, it was also reinforced by the rulers indulging in racial stereotyping and residential segregation. Lack of intermingling still persists. In the early 1900s, Garveyism spurred a great resurgence in Afrocentricity and black pride. Almost simultaneously, there was resurgence in regaining ties with India. These factors compounded to widening the divide between these two races. Most Indians want a state in which cultural pluralism will be an accepted norm, in which they can be both Guyanese or Trinidadian and Indian. Africans tend to acknowledge only one cultural standard as congruent with Guyanese or Trinidadian identity, and also do not accept the legitimacy of a uniquely Indian identity. The two groups share the same state but have very different conceptions of the nation. Suriname is distinct in some ways, stemming mainly from its Dutch colonial history. For example, conversion to Christianity has not been prominent since Dutch policy was not inclined to combine education and conversion. Conditions of work were somewhat better here because, as late entrants to indenture, Dutch policy learned some lessons from the neighboring Guyana's experience. With this introduction, we will now visit the specific histories and issues in each of these three major countries in the Caribbean. Trinidad consists of two islands, Trinidad and Tobago. People of African and Indian descent are the two major groups. The former is larger and the latter a significant minority. The native Amerindian population is minuscule and there are many other small and recent immigrant groups of varying ethnicities. European settlers from the 16th century onwards brought in black slaves. This increased in the early period of British colonialism. In 1807, the UK Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act 1807, abolished slave trade, and the Slavery Abolition Act 1833 abolished the practice of slavery. Indentured labor was brought mainly from India to replace freed African slaves who refused to continue working on the sugar plantations. Their descendants are today's Indo-Trinidadians or East Indians as they are colloquially referred to. Given the large number of ethnic identities, 1/5 of the citizens have a mixed ethnic heritage drawing from varied ancestry. When immigrants from India first arrived in Trinidad in 1845, they were relatively small compared to the African population. Majority were Hindu from a variety of castes, and there were a few Muslim communities too. They were drawn from mainly UP and Bihar regions. Today, the Indian community is divided roughly half and half between those who maintained their original religions and those who have converted to Christianity or have no religious affiliation. The East Indians increased their numbers and presently at 500,000, they are the single largest ethnic group in the country. Beginning as sugar plantation workers, most chose to stay on, gradually acquired property and became peasant farmers steeped in the Indian ethos. In the first several decades after immigration, this largely peasant community organized its life, adapting to the new location. While there was some homogenizing to create an Indian culture, its dominant component was Bhojpuri culture and devotional Hinduism revolving around temple worship. The Ramayana was a prominent presence as an ideal and as a performative motif. Festival ceremonies and rituals were adapted to fit the seasonal cycles of cane growing. Yet in the changed circumstances, Orthodox Hinduism loosened up and caste and gender rules were modified and simplified. Over the decades, the official forms of religiosity became more organized and canonical, but at the popular level, local devotional practices continued to hold sway, as Vertovec describes. This was common to Guyana and Suriname as well. From the early 20th century, Trinidadian society itself was getting urbanized. The East Indians started making forays into business, menial services, middle-level retail trade, and gradually started entering professional occupations. Already oriented towards education for children, they took advantage of the educational opportunities provided by Christian missionaries and emerged as an urban educated professional class. The advent of Arya Samaj triggered a trend of greater reflection on religion. The high rate of conversion of Hindus into Christianity elicited a response of greater religious cohesion. Since the 1950s, the Sanatana Dharma Mahasabha has given Hinduism in Trinidad an organizational structure which has also functioned as a base for propagating the Hindu viewpoint in the ethnic politics of the country. The earlier family structure, adapted from the Hindu patriarchal joint family, started shifting towards nuclearization. Bhojpuri was the language of primary group communication. By the 1940s, English had started making inroads, and by 1970s, English had replaced Bhojpuri as the primary language. Apart from the macro processes of modernization, these shifts also reflected the desire of the Indians to integrate better. The economic position of a section of East Indians improved in the hydrocarbon-based economy, which witnessed a boom in the 1970s. The Indian tendency to pool family resources helped this process. With the economic downturn in the 1980s, there has been emigration to US and Canada. However, there were limits to the nature of adaptation of Indians to Trinidadian society, as also to the level of acceptance of Indians by the large African segment of the population. Right from the time of independence in 1962, the relations between Indians and Africans was not cordial. Its genesis lies in the colonial period, with its black slaves and white ruling class. The import of indentured labor brought in a middle group, mainly Indian. The Africans and the East Indians, the two big ethnic groups, were ignorant of each other's history and culture, and this gave rise to racial stereotypes. Africans considered the Indians to be a threat to their newly won freedom from slavery, while Indians feared contact with the Africans, which they considered would diminish their racial purity. This mindset fueled the ethnic politics and electoral dynamics of the country, as we shall see shortly. Indian labor had some brushes with the colonial government on issues of the practice of festivals, wage cuts, etc. The bulk of the rural Indian population remained outside mainstream Trinidad politics until the 1920s, when partial elections were held, and then with adult franchise in 1945, their value as a vote bank became recognized. By the middle of the 20th century, East Indians were mobilizing around Indian identity and participating in electoral politics. Independence of India in 1947 added to their pride in their identity. Post-independence politics revolved around African versus Indian ethnic-based parties. Over the decades, both African and Indian parties have had their turns at forming the government. As a community, the East Indians have been cohesively organized, even though internally at various times there have been splits and different parties have held sway among them. The Democratic Labour Party (DLP), established in 1957, was the first strong and representative party of the East Indians in the opposition during the rule of the African-based People's National Movement or PNM party. Then from 1976, the United Labour Front under the leadership of Basdev Pandey became its representative. Despite efforts by the Black Power movement in the 1970s to bring about African East Indian solidarity, the East Indian community stayed aloof, pressed on for inclusion into the Trinidad cultural identity, but insisted on its own terms. On the other hand, cracks started appearing within the African-based PNM, a once united party. In addition, a chasm developed between the black elite and the black masses, which created further fissures within the African community. Even though the ULF, under Basdev Pandey's leadership, lessened racial tension and pushed for more inclusive concept of class consciousness, still, both East Indians and Africans continued with ethnic politics, and over 2 decades, in 1995, the Indian-based faction successfully acquired crossover support to win as the United National Congress. Basdev Pandey became Prime Minister, the first person of Indian origin to do so. He was also the head of the Sugar Workers Union. He again won in 2000, but narrowly. Indians were never legally excluded from the Trinidad identity, but for a long time chose to operate within a communal framework where they felt much more secure. The constitution that came in force after independence in 1962 created some misgivings among Indians. A new constitution came into force in 1976, some of whose provisions have been criticized by the East Indians as being biased against them. With societal maturity, however, and with the growing economic pains of the nation, the gradual inclusion was noticeable. When Pandey took office in 1995, the multiculturalist model adopted in countries such as Canada and Australia, built around the growing immigrant ethnic minority groups, was considered not applicable to Trinidad, since East Indians were able to retain their cultural identity without being denied full participation as citizens. There was no express desire for any official policy to address discrimination, despite concerns having been raised in the past by East Indians. With the change in government from a predominantly African-based PNM to a predominantly East Indian-based UNC, there was the perception within the African community of racial bias in distribution of state resources. This issue has been simmering since then and continues to inform Trinidadian politics. Culture and nurturance of cultural diversity seems to feature prominently in all the political discourses in Trinidad. At the time of independence, Trinidad was a divided society, which was the background against which Eric Williams, regarded widely as the father of the nation of Trinidad and Tobago, gave a clear signal that communities must express not merely political but cultural and other loyalties to the nation. This approach was not geared to accommodate the distinct identity that East Indians had developed. They therefore remained somewhat aloof from mainstream cultural developments. Nevertheless, they were politically visible and assertive. This simmering discontent over the decades among Indo-Trinidadians is the backdrop against which organized Hinduism arose in the form of the Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha, led by a charismatic leader called Sat Maharaj. Between 2002 and 2010, when the PNM was again in power, and was emphasizing on a more nationalistic policy, there was a call from Mahasabha for a formal official multicultural policy. In 2010, after East Indian Kamala Persad Bisesar became Prime Minister, she inaugurated the official multicultural policy, widely interpreted as a gesture towards Sat Maharaj. The official policy was geared to giving Indo-Trinidadians an equitable representation in society and polity, but it has led to a vociferous debate on whether official multiculturalism was based on a naive and indeed pernicious ideology, which assumed that it was somehow natural that society should be divided into separate and disconnected ethnic groups. Each group was assumed to have its own tribal spaces, political values, and cultural traditions, while at the same time expecting barriers to participation in national life to be effectively removed. This debate in Trinidadian politics and society continues, with the East Indian and African descent populations in a constant dynamic of integration and separation. For a long time after their arrival, Indians were regarded as outsiders. They themselves also nurtured grievances over their treatment by the Africans and African-based political regimes. But over time, Indians have become assertive and also held political power. Despite racial, ethnic, and cultural differences, there is a great deal of integration as well. They consider themselves and are considered by other ethnic groups to be an integral part of Caribbean society. At the level of popular culture, the Indian-African interaction and synthesis has had robust and creative results. The highly popular soca dance form, which is a syncretic fusion of the traditional Caribbean calypso and Indian dance forms, has been named to reflect this merger. The last letter of calypso and the first letter of the Hindi alphabet Ka have come together in the name soca. Now we move on to Guyana. While contemporary Guyana is also like Trinidad, characterized by ethnic tensions between the East Indian majority and the African descent minority, the intensity of hostility is higher, with the ever-present danger of violence erupting. The population of African descent has a prominent presence in the army, police, and in public service institutions, and their representative party has also had its stint at running the government. The origins of the hostilities in the British colonial government's policy of dividing the black ex-slave labour and the Indian indentured labour is similar to the Trinidadian case. The topography of Guyana, with flat coastlands and mangrove swamps below sea level, made its colonization a difficult task. Due to its relative underdevelopment, the freed African slaves were able to buy land adjacent to the sugar plantations and create their own villages. From this position of strength, the advent of indentured labour was looked upon with suspicion and worry. There was considerable labour and unrest in indentureship, which was met with brutal and violent reprisals, giving rise to protest and resistance. The East Indian Guyanese social universe here too was pretty similar to that in Trinidad and in Suriname as well, so that one can talk of a common Indo-Caribbean social and cultural ethos. Owing to the difficulty of reclaiming land due to Guyana's distinctive topography, many more Indians remained in the plantations for a longer time than was the case in Trinidad. The travails of plantation life created unprecedented solidarity in the Indo-Guyanese community. The power and support of the joint family helped them to move into middle-class status, fueled economically by rice cultivation, cattle farming, commerce, and Western education. Indian ascendancy through land acquisition aggravated African fear in the villages. Like in Trinidad, education aided by the Canadian Presbyterian Mission and professionalization led to the creation of an East Indian middle class by the 1920s. From the 1940s, there was a sharp demographic change, with the Indian population growing faster than the African. This sharpened the political rivalries between the two. The atmosphere was permeated with racial stereotypes. The proportion of women was very low in the early decades, but they were workers in their own right and exhibited a degree of freedom in sexual and marital choices. Family structure stabilized over time when the proportion of men and women became nearly equal by the 1920s, and this also resulted in the firm entrenchment of the patriarchal joint family. So in this phase, gender relations were of the traditional Indian kind, with many controls and restraints on women as compared to the earlier phase of relative freedom and mobility. Still, efforts of Indian educationists like J.I. Ramphal in promoting education for girls did lead to a section of women gaining higher education and pursuing professional careers. A strong sense of community solidarity and connectedness with India as motherland was prevalent among Guyanese Indians. This was reinforced by a powerful intellectual discourse within Guyana on the glory of ancient Indian civilization. Contributing to this were the books of Reverend H. V. P. Bronkhurst, an Anglo-Indian missionary and writer, and his acolyte Joseph Ruhomon of Indian descent, and Bechu, who wrote critically of the indentured labor system. A number of Indo-Guyanese associations were formed, and they gave platform for expressions of community identity. The fear and resentment among the African descent population about the numerical, educational, and economic ascendancy of the East Indians resulted in a constant competition and hostilities. The proposal to revive free immigration from India in the 1920s was opposed fiercely by the black groups, as this would tilt the demography in favor of Indians. In an overall climate of resurgent Indian pride, the continuing violence and suffering of the Indian plantation labor gave rise to vigorous trade unionism to defend the rights of workers and politicize them. Prominent Indian figure in this was Ayub Edun, who formed the Manpower Citizens Association. Elaborating on this theme of the exploitative nature of the plantation economy was the Marxist leader Chedi Jagan, who became a key player in the ethnic politics of the country through his People's Progressive Party or PPP. When electoral democracy dawned in the country, the ethnic politics worsened. The British played a destructive role in trying to undermine PPP's electoral victory in 1953 by creating splits along ethnic lines, principally between people of Indian descent who supported Jagan's PPP and Afro-Guyanese in support of a breakaway faction which eventually became the PNC or People's National Congress. Despite visionary qualities and the overwhelming support of the Indians, Jagan failed because of his inflexible Marxism and his overtures to Cuba, which resulted in the Western powers collaborating to defeat him. Eventually, after the end of the Cold War, Chedi Jagan was re-elected and became Prime Minister in 1992 and continued in office till his death in 1997. While the PPP continues to be politically strong, the contemporary situation in Guyana is rife with problems and issues arising out of the decay from the 1960s onwards. Drug trafficking is a major problem, as also crime and corruption. But a small, rich minority, both African and Indian, are benefiting and have vested interests in preventing reform. The Indian distrust of Africans and the latter's resentment as having been electorally worsted has kept the racial tensions simmering, and unless there is some negotiated power-sharing arrangement, dangers of violent upheavals remain. There have been some efforts to bridge this divide through multiracial alliances. In 2006, a new party, the Alliance for Change, has surfaced with a constructive agenda of bridging the racial divide and bringing economic development and social harmony to Guyana. It is a multi-ethnic movement that has given voice to a new generation of Guyanese who say that politics has held the country back by favoring race over merit. It has drawn support from both Afro and Indo-Guyanese, as well as members of indigenous groups. It emerged as a real political force during the elections of 2001. Since then, it has challenged several initiatives of the PPP government and forced both the major parties to rethink their ethnopolitics. It represents hope for the future. Suriname is the third major country in the Caribbean. It is also a multi-ethnic and plural society. The people of Indian descent are called Hindustanis, and they migrated as indentured labor in the last century. Today, they form the largest ethnic group of the population at 37%. The second largest ethnic group are the Creoles, people of mixed African and European heritage, who form 31%. And there are many other small ethnic groups. Suriname, after being a bone of contention between various European powers, became a Dutch colony. The differences between society and culture in Suriname, as compared to both Trinidad and Guyana, lie to some extent in the nature of the colonial rule. But of course, like elsewhere in the Caribbean, the conditions of work were difficult. In later years, some labor was imported from Indonesia. In 1920, indentured labor was legally abolished. The response of the indentured ranged from resignation to open and violent resistance. From the end of the 19th century, government actively promoted the permanent settlement of Hindustanis who moved occupationally to becoming smallholders who produced rice, vegetable, fruit, meat and milk. Post-World War II, Suriname shifted to bauxite production. There was also mechanization of agriculture. New employment opportunities opened up and urbanization and westernization grew, the Hindustanis too got pulled into these currents, and by the 1970s, their educational and economic development had improved to match the Afro-Surinamis. Internal economic differentiation was the highest among Hindustanis. Due to a higher birth rate, they became the largest group by 1970, and later they also started wielding cultural influence and political power. Hindustanis have socially and culturally evolved a distinct identity by maintaining their Indian cultural profile while adapting to some aspects of Caribbean culture. Interethnic marriage among Hindustanis is not high. In the early decades, the low standard of living and marginalization combined to compel Hindustanis towards recreation of a little India in the Caribbean environment. One striking example of the adaptation of Hindustanis to their environment while retaining their Bhojpuri roots is the Saranami language, also called the Caribbean Hindustani, a creole which the migrants created while communicating with each other on the sea voyage and on landing. Saranami has a Hindustani base but is distinct because of words added from Dutch and from the Afro-Suriname lingua franca. This is a unique development. The Dutch educational and cultural policy, unlike the British, did not emphasize on replacing mother tongue with the colonial language. Saranami became the home language of the Hindustani people of Suriname. Immigrants, especially in the 20th century, started forming associations to promote their ethnic interests. On the eve of the 21st century, ethnicity took on a cultural dimension as well. The rise of the diasporas and the impact of global diasporic culture, particularly on the Asian groups in Suriname, have reinforced ethnicity in the cultural domain. The idea of the Indian diaspora and the digital penetration of Bollywood have given a boost to the ethnic identity of the Hindustani community. In the 20th century, ethnicity was important in politics. One of the early ethnic formations in politics was the Hindustan's Javanese Politike Party, where the Indians were the dominant partners. The VHP, or the United Hindustani Party, was founded in 1949. It consolidated Indian ethnicity under its leader Jagannath Lakshman. Hindustanis and Afro-Surinamis did have political rivalries and hostilities, but not with violent manifestations. Independence in 1975 triggered large-scale Hindustani migration to Netherlands for fear of Afro-Surinamese domination. After independence, there was widespread deterioration of socio-economic and political conditions, leading to a military takeover in 1980-87. After this, the trend of power sharing and alliances between political parties has got established. While at the end of the 20th century, the role of ethnicity in the political field became less prominent for the Hindustani group in Suriname, ethnicity in the cultural domain became more important. The cultural diversity was reinforced, particularly because the Asian groups came in contact with the rising diasporas and improved their cultural infrastructure, the use of information and communication technology. They consumed and relied more heavily on their ancient and now global culture. Low international travel costs, mobile phones, and the internet became driving forces. The nature of ethnic relations in Suriname during the 20th century can be characterized as one of mutual tolerance and harmony, but also of ambiguity. The role ethnicity played in daily interaction was tremendous and overt, but sometimes covert. The inter-ethnic relations were cordial in general. The three Caribbean countries that we have considered are a remarkable example of how colonial policy created and reinforced ethnic divisions and whose impact can be felt even a couple of centuries after the demise of colonialism. The differences between Trinidad and Guyana, which can be taken together, and Suriname on the other hand, can be seen as reflecting the differing natures of British colonialism versus Dutch colonialism. Unlike some of the other countries in the old diaspora like Malaysia or South Africa or Fiji, in all these Caribbean countries, the Indian ethnic population is in a majority, and this has impacted the nature of interethnic relations. In the Caribbean countries, the Indian origin population has established its legitimacy as citizens, yet in interethnic relations there is underlying tension. This is the story of the Caribbean.